Well, welcome. My name is John Pentangelo. I'm the director of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture on the USS Cumberland with our very special guest, Dr. Anna Holloway. This, ladies and gentlemen, is our first in-person lecture in this gallery since November 2019. That was the last sort of event of the season, and then, of course, we're ramping up for the next spring when COVID hit. So welcome back to us all. We have been open since May, but this is our first in-house event. So many of you know that the Battle of Hampton Roads occurred from March 8th to March 9th, 1862, just 11 months into the American Civil War and 160 years ago today. It was the world's first battle between ironclad warships, and it forever changed naval history. Technological advancements in iron armor and exploding ordnance and steam propulsion, they ensured that naval warfare, which had remained more or less consistent over 350 years, was about to change forever. You had the Union Navy, who drew upon the wealth, industrial might, and maritime infrastructure of the northern states, and though small at first, it actually quite impressively grew to over 670 vessels that were responsible for the protection of over 3,000 miles of southern coastline. And without a doubt, the United States Navy controlled the seas. And to combat their formidable opponent, the Confederacy employed commerce raiders on the open water and a small number of ironclads on the coasts and on the rivers. The first of these armored warships, the Confederate ironclad Virginia, was converted from the scuttled steam frigate Merrimac just across the river here at what's now known as the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. The reports of her conversion caused a panic throughout the North, as many in Washington feared Virginia would steam right up to Potomac River and shell the nation's capital. The Lincoln administration did not sit idly by, and the Union Navy set to work to build their own ironclad. The Navy issued contracts for new designs, and the first completed was the revolutionary USS Monitor. Now, the clash of these two vessels on March 9th in Hampton Roads has been studied and debated and honored and celebrated, dramatized and remembered, both at home and abroad, for 160 years. And though we as a people are right to do all of that, I also feel that we have made a grave mistake. In concentrating on the events of March 9th, 1862, we have relegated the events of the day before to a footnote, or perhaps a prologue, or a first act to some great drama. At worst, we've forgotten the events of the day altogether. Ladies and gentlemen, we were wrong to do so. On March 8th, before Monitor arrived on the scene, the CSS Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads to destroy the ships of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, vessels that stood as sentinels to the gates of this vital harbor. Armed with an iron ram in her bow, the Virginia crashed into the wooden sloop-of-war USS Cumberland, leaving a gaping hole in her starboard bow. Cumberland's acting commander, Lieutenant George C. Morris, refused to surrender and ordered his guns to fire at Virginia's impenetrable iron casemate, even as water poured into Cumberland's lower decks. Ultimately, 121 of her crew perished as the ship sank to the bottom of Hampton Roads. With her upper masts piercing the surface of the water, her colors still flew in honor of this brave last stand. Now, the heated solid shot from Virginia's guns then set the frigate USS Congress ablaze, and she too sank. The frigate Minnesota had run aground and seemed doomed to the same fate as the wooden warships before her, but darkness and falling tides forced an end to the attack on that day, the U.S. Navy's worst defeat until December 7th, 1941. On the evening of March 8, 1862, the Monitor, of course, arrived to protect the USS Minnesota, and the next day saw the famous duel between the ironclads. December 7th, 1941. Think about that date for a moment. Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona, 1,177 sailors and Marines killed aboard. Imagine for a moment that a seminal naval battle, such as the Battle of Midway, somehow occurred the following day on December 8th. Would those men resting in the wrecked steel of that great battleship, now be a footnote? I hope not. In any event, the great thing about time is that it affords us the opportunity to think and to evolve, and we can now look at the events of March 8th with a new lens, one that views the day as the final act in the history of a fine wooden warship, defended to the last by sailors of the United States Navy. In the face of certain defeat, in the jaws of death, they did their duty to the last. Did they revolutionize sea power? No. Did they change the course of the war? No. What they unknowingly did was become the heart of the 21st century sailor's creed, recited by all enlisted personnel in the United States Navy today. They each recite the words, "I represent the fighting spirit of the Navy and those who have gone before me to defend freedom and democracy around the world." They might as well say, "I represent the crew of the United States sloop-of-war Cumberland on March 8th, 1862. Now today, the Hampton Roads Naval Museum has the honored distinction of being the official repository for the artifacts that have been salvaged from the wreck of USS Cumberland. In the early 1980s, underwater archaeologists brought up many of these items from the wreck off Newport News. In 1983, these items were transferred to the museum. Unfortunately, many more were brought up illegally by watermen using clamming tongs. And some of them took that looted copper and melted it down and refashioned them into Civil War-style belt buckles and sold them to collectors. And when federal agents recovered these artifacts, they too became part of the museum's collection to be preserved and shared with the public. I'm proud to announce that we are working to bring more of these treasures to the public in our gallery and to focus more of our interpretation on the USS Cumberland. We look forward to unveiling this new exhibit next year, but we start this initiative this very evening. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you enjoy the program. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Anna Holloway. Dr. Holloway is the Fleet History Team Lead with the Histories branch of the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. As that is our parent command, that makes her a shipmate. There she is responsible for the team that produces the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships. By a show of hands, how many people have used the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships? Yeah, quite a bit. So if you have any questions, here she is, or any updates. She's also responsible for projects dealing with sailor stories, with fleet history, and fleet support. Prior to joining NHHC in 2020, she was the Museum Services Director of Search Incorporated, a global archaeological and cultural resources management firm. From 2014 to 2017, she served as the Maritime Historian for the National Park Service, where she also administered the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act program and assisted in the administration of the National Maritime Heritage Grant Program. From 2000 to 2014, Anna served in a number of roles at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, culminating as Vice President of Museum Collections and Programs. This included oversight of the USS Monitor Center. As curator of the award-winning USS Monitor Center, she led a multidisciplinary team in the creation of the 20,000 square foot exhibition and assisted in the development of the center's state-of-the-art conservation facility. She has lectured internationally on a variety of maritime topics, published articles in naval history, Civil War Times, American Heritage, among others, curated numerous exhibitions and programs, appeared on national television, most recently in the National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, and she's the co-author with Jonathan White of Our Little Monitor, published in 2018. The Winston-Salem native graduated from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro with baccalaureate degrees in English literature and classical medieval civilization. And she received her master's degree in early modern history and her PhD in American history from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, Anna Holloway.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Wow, this is my first in-person lecture since a similar Tuesday in March of 2020. So thank you for joining me in this auspicious occasion where we're all tentatively coming back out from the darkness into the light, I hope. But I've been looking forward to this evening, and I hope that you will enjoy the program. I do want to mention one thing. There's some shipmates of mine from the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, which is where I got my start in maritime history way back in 1990 when they hired someone from North Carolina, where the biggest amount of water I had seen was about this big, and somehow turned me into a sailor. So welcome, shipmates. Let me get the technology here going. All right. First off, for anyone who was looking for my email address and phone number and all, there you have it. Just wanted to put that up there, and I can give that to you if you need it later, if you have any questions or complaints. But we'll go ahead and get started. So tonight, we'll be looking at the merest sliver of Cumberland's career. And yes, she had a long career. She was authorized in 1816, laid down in 1824, but finally launched in 1842. During that time, she spent time in the Mediterranean, supported the Mexican-American War, back to the Mediterranean 2 more times, where she apparently had a pretty epic party in Sardinia in 1853. It's pretty amazing what they decked out on the ship there. She also then had a makeover. Between 1855 and 1857, she was converted from a frigate to a sloop-of-war. She was now sleeker, faster, and carried heavier and better ordnance. And just prior to the American Civil War, she cruised off Africa as a flagship of the Africa Squadron on slave trade patrol. She returned to the home squadron in 1860, serving as flagship and cruising off Veracruz during a civil war there. But as her own nation limped towards its own civil war, she was called back home and took up position at Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth, Virginia, to monitor the deteriorating situation. When Union troops destroyed the yard in April 1861, she was really the only capital ship to escape the destruction. Towed out in the lurid glow of the burning yard, she briefly dragged some of her scuttled companions as she made her way to safety. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Tonight, we will narrow our focus to a moment in time and how that moment became seared in a nation's memory. So this won't be an exhaustive look at all the minutiae of March 8th. It will be more about how people observed it. So let's set the stage. We'll start on March 7th, 1862. Actually, we'll start on March 6th a little bit. Bad weather was prevailing in Hampton Roads and along the East Coast. The CSS Virginia lay ruminating at her berth in Portsmouth, and Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan was itching to take her out and take on the Union fleet in Hampton Roads. Now, he had originally wanted to do this on the 6th, but bad weather kept him in port. In urgency, the Union ironclad Monitor was also fighting her way south from New York in an attempt to arrive in Hampton Roads in time to sink Virginia before she could leave her moorings. Now, on the 7th of March, Commodore John Marston of USS Roanoke, a Union naval commander in Hampton Roads, received a telegram from Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. It read, "Send the St. Lawrence, Congress, and Cumberland into the Potomac River. Let the disposition of the remainder of the vessels at Hampton Roads be made according to your best judgment after consultation with General Wool. Use steam to tow them up. I will also try to send a couple of steamers from Baltimore to assist. Let there be no delay." Well, if you know anything about Gideon Welles, he was sometimes the master of mixed messaging, because he then sent a second message telling Marston to wait for additional orders carried by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Vasa Fox, who was traveling to Hampton Roads and would arrive on the 8th. So Marston waited. And that is why the St. Lawrence, Congress, and Cumberland stayed in Hampton Roads and were not protecting the White House. The morning of March 8, 1862 was a marked contrast to the foul weather of the days preceding. It was perfect for taking the Confederate ironclad out into Hampton Roads. Now, with workmen still on board, They were actually leaping off of the ship as she was leaving out with some work undone. Flag Officer Buchanan ordered his crew to ready the vessel for a cruise. Now, most of the men on board believed this was going to be a shakedown cruise, but Buchanan had confided to his officers that he intended to take the vessel directly into battle. So as the crew cast off the mooring lines, those workers who had been installing the fore and aft gunport shutters leapt to the dock, and the Virginia was underway. Now, underway for her was about 4 knots. So it's going to take her a long time to go down the Elizabeth River and get into Hampton Roads. Lots of time for people to observe her. And those observing her departure kept eerily silent. Recalled many of the crew. They believed that the people were in pre-mourning mode because surely iron could not float. And as the Virginia neared Craney Island, Commander Buchanan reportedly said, quote, "Sailors, in a few minutes you will have the long-looked-for opportunity of showing your devotion to our cause. Remember that you are about to strike for your country and your homes. The Confederacy expects every man to do his duty, beat to quarters." Then he reminded them, "The whole world is watching you today." Now, privately, he must have had mixed feelings about this because, like many others in this war, he'd soon be opening fire upon his own flesh and blood. His brother, Thomas McKean Buchanan, was the paymaster on board USS Congress. But now, as the Virginia steamed down the Elizabeth River, both banks were crowded with people, and many were just kind of curious about the ship's strange appearance. They'd heard about it, some had seen it. One person from Alabama observed that she looked like a powerful battery resembling the roof of a house as seen on the water. Some refused to believe in her, calling out, "Go on with your old metallic coffin." And those with a richer sense of history realized that the day had finally come, that here was to be tried the great experiment of ram and ironclad in naval warfare. Now, Saturday, March 8, 1862, was Laundry Day for the crews of the Union's North Atlantic Blockading Squadron in Hampton Roads, and I'll have an image of the laundry hanging in the rigging a little bit later. But the rigging of the wooden vessels was festooned with blue and white clothing drying in the late winter sun. And shortly after noon, the quartermaster of Congress, which was anchored off Newport News Point, saw something strange through his telescope. And he turned to the ship's surgeon and said, "I wish you would take this glass and have a look over there. Sir, I believe that thing is a-coming down at last." Well, that thing was the Virginia. Now, the men of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron had grown weary of waiting for the Virginia to come out, and so now they're scrambling for battle. And in the panic of the moment, and with the tide at ebb, several vessels ran aground, including Congress and the Minnesota. Now, this is an amazing image that my colleague who's in the audience, Marcus Robbins, shared with me. It's from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum. Wonderful image there of Virginia approaching Cumberland. And Cumberland was, in fact, Buchanan's first target, though he traded broadsides with Congress, all the while steaming slowly and inexorably towards Cumberland. He chose her in the belief that her guns were rifled and more deadly to Virginia, though this was not entirely the case. Firing first with the Virginia's forward 7-inch Brooke rifle, Buchanan then turned broadside to the wooden ship, wreaking deadly havoc on her gun crews, who couldn't maneuver the ship with their spring lines that they had erected to make an effective return of fire. Here's another eyewitness view here. Determined to finish her off quickly, Buchanan rammed the Cumberland on her starboard side, and the hole below her waterline was large, and the ship immediately began to sink, nearly taking the Virginia with her, and unbeknownst to Buchanan, separating the ram from the Virginia. Now, I want to pause and tell you a little bit about this image, because it's not one often seen, but this image was supplied to the Mariners Museum when we opened Monitor Center for the grand opening, and it was either drawn by or made at the request of the Virginia's boatswain, Charles Hazelwood Hasker. He has the distinction not only of serving on board Virginia, but also being one of the few survivors of Hunley when he was a volunteer on board that. He went all the way down to the bottom and then swam back up. After the war, he would give lectures around Virginia, and in a version of 19th century PowerPoint, he would have easels set up with different images about his escapades set up around the stage, and he would do illustrated lectures this way. The family of Hasker did believe that he perhaps may have drawn this himself from memory, because some of the other ones that you'll see in his collection, I've got, I think, one more, are done by a very different kind of artist. But I just wanted to pause for that. Now, I'm going to give you a firsthand account of what was going on board Cumberland, and I'm going to do it from a less well-known memoir. It's of Marine Daniel O'Connor, who survived the sinking of the Cumberland, and he described the agony and frustration of the scene in a letter home just a few days later. O'Connor recalls, he said, at the said time, about 3:15 in the afternoon, Cumberland was sunk by the Merrimack, driving a hole through her that you could drag your body through, and her prow right on the starboard bow. None of our shots did not have any effect on her. She came about 50 yards of us before she fired a shell, and every shell she fired killed some. I was first loader of cabin guns, and being always on the port sides, I had a chance to see every shell she fired. She came alongside twice, and you could hear them cheer, but you could not see them. I hear them laugh, which was aggravating to us in that predicament. Now, according to O'Connor, an officer from the Virginia asked acting commanding officer Lieutenant George Upham Morris to surrender the Cumberland. But Morris retorted, according to O'Connor, "Damn you, you coward, you have made a slaughterhouse of the ship. We will sink with our colors first." "Sink it is," said the rebel sailor. Now, several men from the Cumberland attempted to board the Virginia but thought better of it. But O'Connor remembers that was a no-go. He said, "We could not board her. You could not step on the quarterdeck without walking through blood. Men's legs in one place, arms in another. The poor fellows that were wounded all got drowned." Lieutenant Morris soon thereafter shouted to his crew, "All hands, save yourselves," as the ship continued to slip beneath the waves. Now, O'Connor must have experienced an incredible adrenaline rush at that point as he realized how tenuous his situation had become. He said, "The ship was turning over then, and I was praying one of the guns. She struck me on the shoulder and knocked me down. All the guns was running in. I picked myself up as quick as possible and got out the porthole just as the water was commencing. When I got out on the side, I took my coat off and was in the act of taking my shoes off when I found myself up to my neck in water. I would not trust to the boats. There were so many getting into them, I thought they would go down, so I struck out for shore." Now, O'Connor was one of the lucky ones. He was eventually picked up by another boat and taken safely to the shore. Others, 121, were not so fortunate. Scores of Union sailors from the Cumberland died at their guns or went down with their ship, guns still firing and flags still defiantly waving. Now, this is another of one of Hasker's PowerPoint slides, I believe probably done by the artist Arthur Woad. So he had a variety of artists working for him, but here is another scene of men getting into those boats, some striking out for shore on their own, but a chaotic scene to be sure. Now, Private J. Tyler Jobson of Company G of the 9th Virginia was watching this from shore, and he says, "The Cumberland went down bow foremost with her colors flying, her crew bravely fighting her guns. After the last shot, the ship's crew could be seen running up the rigging to save themselves. She was game to the last." So even in this heated battle, the adversaries had great admiration for the Cumberland crew. And this wonderful illustration from Harper's Weekly was done just a few weeks after the battle of March 8th and 9th, and it shows the events of both days there. Now, we all know the stories of the thousands of people witnessing the battle from the amphitheater that is Hampton Roads. And for some, interestingly, they could see the destruction, but they could not hear it. Colonel R.E. Colston of the 16th Virginia Infantry was commanding a Confederate brigade on the south side of the James River, and he was overseeing the shore batteries at Craney Island. He recalled a curious incident from that first day of the battle, an effect that we now call acoustic shadows. He said, "The cannonade was visibly raging with redoubled intensity, but to our amazement, not a sound was heard from us from the commencement of the battle." He said, "A strong March wind was blowing direct from us towards Newport News. We could see every flash of the guns and the clouds of white smoke, but not a single report was audible." Can you imagine how eerie that must have been? But now at Fort Monroe, or Fortress Monroe, the opposite was nearly true. While some of the battle could be seen from the ramparts, much of it was obscured. And here is just a wonderful account from two young brothers who were at Fortress Monroe. 14-year-old telegrapher John O'Brien heard the battle begin, and he sent a message to George Callum, the operator at Newport News Point. Callum confirmed that the Merrimac had come out. And John's older brother, Richard, who was also a telegrapher, was monitoring the telegraph at Fortress Monroe for traffic. And he found himself listening to a live account of the battle as the news clicked through the office in American Morse code. Now, the next is going to sound, this is his memoir of it, but I think it's pretty amazing because today we can view war 24/7 on the television. Here is someone hearing it through news media live. But he said, "'Tis Callum, and this is what he telegraphs. She is steering straight for the Cumberland." A pause. "The Cumberland gives her a broadside." Waiting at the fort. "She keels over." Suspense. "Seems to be sinking." Anxious, watching. "No, she comes on again." Great anxiety. "She has struck the Cumberland and poured a broadside into her. God, the Cumberland is sinking." Breathless suspense. "The Cumberland has fired her last broadside." Now, Callum's office at Newport News Point afforded him a front row seat to the battle as he was tapping it out, but it was not without peril. Shells from the conflict actually shrieked through his quarters, and two of them tore through his office as he is tapping this out, and the young brothers at Fortress Monroe are listening. Now, the Virginia broke free from the Cumberland and steamed slowly into the James River, and the men on the stranded Congress began to cheer, thinking they had been spared the same horrific fate. But that cheer was cut short when they saw Virginia begin to make her long, slow, ponderous turn as she turned her sights on Congress. I'll give Congress her due now. The Virginia's withering firepower tore into the Congress for nearly 2 hours, and with most of the crew dead or wounded, including the commanding officer, the next in command, Lieutenant Commander Austin Pendergrast, surrendered the Congress. One of the gunners recalled the emotion upon the Congress around the time of the surrender. He said, "Our little powder boy, a lad of only 13 years of age, would bring us ammunition with tears streaming down his cheeks. He had pure grit and stuck to his duties like a man." Although the order to cease firing had come, this gunner noted, "My gun was loaded at the time, and all the order had been given. I pulled the lanyard and fired what proved to be the last shot ever fired on board the fated Congress." Now, the fog of war is indeed real. And we'll swing back to Lieutenant Morris's words to the Virginia and to his crew. And these words have as many variations as Farragut's later damned the torpedoes. Some eyewitnesses say it was likely that Morris had said nothing, since it would have been impossible to hear any calls from the Virginia for the Cumberland to surrender. Officer William Randall claims that Morris froze up upon hearing the demand and asked him what to do. Randall claims he told Morris, "For Christ's sake, we are sinking already. Let her go down with her colors flying." However it happened, it captured the imagination of the American people. And as fascinating as the ironclads on March 9th were, the Cumberland held her own in public sentiment and became a tragic icon of the passing of an era. To many, this was the moment in which naval warfare forever changed. The wooden walls of the past were no match for the iron sides of the present and the future. Yet it was not merely this passing of the torch from wood to iron that drove poets to write of it or artists to depict it. Quite simply, the Cumberland was not surrendered. She went down with flags flying and guns blazing. Lieutenant George Morris's famous and perhaps apocryphal command, "Give them a broadside, boys, as she goes," captured the imagination of poets and artists like few other lines in war. It was first immortalized by Currier and Ives as a caption to their 1862 lithograph, "The Sinking of the Cumberland" by the ironclad Merrimac off Newport News, Virginia, March 8, 1862. Now, this was one of Currier and Ives' first lithographs that they were selling, but it did not have as big of an appeal in the northern market simply because it was such a tragic scene. They went on to do other more successful pieces, but this is what the public first saw and heard and knew of Morris's line. It was immortalized here. And it became a rallying cry of Union supporters and troops alike as they wearied of Southern successes. And of course, we all know in trying times, we all need heroes, and Morris supplied them one. Now, the moment of impact where iron met wood was a very powerful trope that attracted a variety of artists over time. So I went through my collection and I've assembled images from Library of Congress, from here at Hampton Roads Naval Museum, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum, Naval History and Heritage Command, you name it. And I started going through them looking for some similarities in these. And what we find is that this moment of impact is illustrated in a variety of ways. So we'll start with one of the earlier ones by Alexander Charles Stewart. And I love this one because you can see the laundry in the rigging. So this is a really lovely depiction of everyday life on a warship, and then an ironclad comes and ruins it. There's several different versions of this one. He painted quite a few, and this is one that happens to be held by the Mariners Museum. In the collections of NHHC, Edward Moran's Iron versus Wood, again, shows a very bombastic interpretation of this, but you can see the blue skies, but also the just huge clouds of powder and smoke. You'll see this one on display here at Hampton Roads Naval Museum. It's a depiction of R.A. Richardson's March 8th image on a postcard. And I love how the tiny, tiny Virginia is coming after the very large Cumberland in this one, but it's still a lovely little image. Bubblegum cards got in on the action here. This is one from the 1950s, I believe, Destructive Blow. And in this one, you can see that the artist has taken a little bit of liberty with the shape of the Virginia, but we'll let them have that. One of the most recent and most powerful images of Cumberland is this one by the artist James Gurney, who some of you may know better as the guy who wrote and illustrated Dinotopia. But he did this actually at the request of National Geographic for an article that they were producing, and unfortunately it didn't appear in the magazine. But he worked with folks at NOAA and at NHHC and at the Mariners Museum to come up with what is one of the more accurate depictions of that moment when Virginia strikes the Cumberland. And just as an aside, you've heard of method acting. I think he does method painting. He wanted to get some good action shots of people jumping off of the stern there, so he put a ladder in his backyard and jumped onto a trampoline repeatedly, and his wife took pictures. So that's all the artist there falling, endlessly falling off of the Cumberland. But this is a truly just powerful view of that moment. But then there are some more somber views, as the one that you saw when you walked in. Let's see. This one done by the Prince de Joinville, Francois d'Orléans. He was in exile from France and was actually on Major General McClellan's staff. He depicts very clearly the evidence of Cumberland's wreckage that would remain visible in Hampton Roads for months. And this is an eyewitness view of just a few days after the battle, with Cumberland still very much apparent with her banner flying. And of course, soldiers and citizens of Hampton Roads would gather souvenirs from Cumberland all throughout this time, and not only from the ship, but from among the items that washed onto the shore. And a lot of things washed ashore. We were talking about that earlier, blankets from the ship, candles, and a little more sobering. In late May of 1862, a Union surgeon who was walking along the shore discovered the body of a sailor from Cumberland floating by the beach. He recalled, "About sundown last night, I was walking on the beach, quietly smoking my pipe, when I saw something which proved to be the body of a man floating on the water just at the edge of the shore. I pulled it up on the beach, covered it with seaweed, and then reported the incident. Meanwhile, I returned to watch, walking up and down in the moonlight or standing by the mound of seaweed, thinking of the poor nameless thing beneath, thinking in ways that a month since were unknown to me. Since coming here, death has faced me at every turn and in every conceivable form, yet my own future, my happiness, and my activity seemed assured to me. Did that poor fellow look forward as confidently, I wondered? Possibly, and yet I cannot think he felt quite as safe as I. Only the moon and the stars in the night could testify. The arrival of the provost marshal forced me back again to the existing facts, and he recognized the body as that of one of the unfortunates who was drowned when the Cumberland was sunk by the Merrimack." And here is another contemporary view, this from the NOAA Monitor National Marine Sanctuary collection that was donated by Jerry Harlow. It's an unknown artist, but it does depict not only where the Congress sank, but also the graves of the sailors who washed ashore from Cumberland and Congress. Now, months later, in 1862, a Union nurse was on her way to Fort Monroe, and she would call the still visible remains of the Cumberland a fit monument grave and a monument as well of heroes. And then, in September of 1862, Fireman George Gear of the Monitor wrote a letter home to his wife, Martha, telling of a pleasant yet poignant cruise taken to view the Cumberland. He said, "The officers have rigged up one of our cutter boats with a sail, and last evening a party of us took a sail around the wreck of Cumberland as she lays in the same place she sank, only her masts are out of water. It is hard to believe there are the bodies of so many poor sailors laying in their watery grave in that ship. And what a sight it will be when they raise her, which the government will do as soon as the war is over. Her sails are still on the yards, everything as she was when she sank. We were gone from the ship about 2 hours and the wind died away, so we had to row back." This poignant image of one of the bodies coming ashore. But Cumberland made her way into the comics as well. In late March 1862, Vanity Fair ran this piece, The Wonderful Economy of Wooden Ships. And you can see, again, that moment of impact, only this time the Virginia is reptilian in nature. And then this little piece here shows Monitor coming for the Merrimack, and there is the Cumberland behind the Monitor, as though she's being protected. But Cumberland would make her way into an iconography that would ever bind her, not just to March 8th, but to March 9th as well, as you can see in this image. Images of the ironclads locked in battle on March 9th were conflated with the Cumberland, caught forever in her death throes, bravely giving that broadside as she went. So I'm going to show you a few of them here. Some of these, the early ones here, are from 1862 and were sold to be framed for your living room. This one's called A Splendid Victory, and you'll note Monitor, Virginia, and the Cumberland giving her last broadside, all on the same day. Now, part of this is because you could sell more prints this way. You get 2 days of battle for the price of one. But it becomes something that is repeated again and again. Here we have the first battle between iron ships of war, Monitor, Virginia, Cumberland giving a last broadside. This one is from a Swedish newspaper. It was the Centerfold. Centerfolds were different back then. And here you've got Virginia, Monitor, and then back here, give them a broadside, boys, as she goes. Now, this one is an interesting one. This is from the 1880s. It's a Kurtz and Allison chromolithograph. And it's got a lot of things going on here. There's a lot to unpack in this image. But one thing that I discovered in looking at it for probably the 1,000th time is, do you see Cumberland there anywhere? No, actually you don't. This is Congress. The Congress gets her due in an image with Monitor and Virginia fighting. And I was thinking, why is Congress here when Cumberland is always the ship that is tied inextricably from these two ironclads? Well, it turns out Cumberland and Congress were featured pieces of a panorama done in the 1880s. And it's a panorama that traveled around the country and was actually seen here at the Jamestown Exposition in 1907. This is what the Cumberland looks like in the panorama. It's exciting, but think about panoramas of the 19th century. They're going to be sound and light shows. There's not going to be a huge amount of sound and certainly no light coming from Cumberland, but there will be from Congress. And so Congress becomes important in some of this iconography simply because she had just a spectacular explosion. And so here is another image from one of those panoramas, and there you see Congress, very, very active, but there you see Cumberland not giving her last broadside. So it's an interesting way of looking at these things and how people apprehended the 2 days of battle. But the Cumberland does remain the star. She's even featured in an 1866 Milton Bradley toy released after the war called the Myriopticon. It was a little toy called a cranky, which basically allowed you to have a moving picture with a lantern behind it with translucent paper with images on it, and you cranked it, and it even had a little narration for the child to give. But in everything, the Cumberland is always sinking with guns blazing. And even modern artists have followed this trope. This particular image was done about, I want to say, it was done in 2012-ish by the Italian-American artist Antonio Benedetto. You might know him a little better as Tony Bennett. But you can see, there she is, giving the last broadside. But the fascination with Cumberland was not purely visual. You could sing about her heroics in popular broadside ballads that were circulated for sale shortly thereafter. This one was sung to the popular tune Raging Canal, which I will not sing to you. But you could sing the battle. You could celebrate the Cumberland crew. This one ends with, God bless our dear banner, the red, white, and blue. Beneath its bright stars we'll call tyrants to tremble or sink at our guns like the Cumberland's crew. And several poets. I mean, I could go on all evening. We'd be here till midnight if I went through all of the poetry, but I'm just going to feature a few. One poet wrote, as an accompaniment to relics from the Cumberland presented to President Lincoln by Shakespearean actor and orator James Murdoch, a piece entitled, quote, "The Piece of Halyard from the Flag of the Cumberland," which is actually a better poem than the title makes it sound. But the rope fragment was, quote, "a shred from off the halyards of our hope," and a battle flag that had not been lowered. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. used the image of the sunken Cumberland with her flag still defiantly flying in a poem that exhorted young men who had not yet enlisted to go to war either never or now. And the poem includes the lines, "Never or now roars the horse-throated cannon through the black canopy blotting the skies. Never or now flaps the shell-blasted pennon or the deep ooze where the Cumberland lies." Now, lest you think that all of these poems are just written by those from the Union, I give you this one from Ossian Gorman, who was a Confederate newspaper correspondent from Macon, Georgia. And while he does claim victory for the Battle of Hampton Roads for the Virginia, He writes this of Cumberland: "The work is done, the frigate turns, in agonizing, doubtful poise. She sinks along the deck. I hear a shrieking, wailing noise. Engulfed beneath those placid waves, disturbed by battle's onward surge, the crew is gone, the vessel sleeps, and whistling bombshells sing her dirge." So he, just like the young infantryman watching the battle from shore, did see the heroism in the men of the Cumberland. And just a few more here. I won't read all of them to you, but I love this one because it talks about those fine old captains, Hull and Perry, looking down. He says, "They're watching us where we found her, with a tear on each tough old cheek. Down she goes, our noble frigate, but the old flag's still at her peak." This one by an anonymous bard, again, talks about how your flag, the gamest of the game, sank proudly with you, not in shame. A dig at the Congress's white flag. Elizabeth Porter Beach was inspired by the event to write The Last Broadside. And she uses those words, apocryphal or not. "Shall we give them a broadside, my boys, as she goes? Shall we send yet another to tell, in iron-tongued words to Columbia's foes, how bravely her sons say farewell?" And like other poets, she made particular mention of the Star-Spangled Banner still floating above. Now, the poem was later set to music by Frank Buckley soon thereafter, and this stirring and kind of bombastic melody made its way onto the pianos in genteel parlors throughout the Northeast. On the occasion of the nation's centennial, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem in honor of the Cumberland. And you can see here again, "Next morn as the sun rose over the bay, still floated our flag at the mainmast head. Lord, how beautiful was thy day." Now, March 8th obviously received the most attention overall. I have 150 pages of poetry about the Battle of Hampton Roads, and I know there's more out there. But March 8th does hold pride of place, and I believe that is because the men of the Cumberland are the heroes, whereas March 9th, it is the machines of Monitor and Virginia. Understandably, though, there were more Southern poems devoted to March 8th and 9th. I think you can see why. But even in those, they are still very much in awe of the Cumberland's crew. And there is the Longfellow set to music. Now, the physical remains of Cumberland were of interest to many, not least of which were the military. Both the Navy and the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to clear the wrecks. You heard George Geer mention that the government was going to do that. And in fact, the Senate in June of 1862 passed a bill appropriating $100,000 for raising sunken vessels for the Navy. And under this bill, the Cumberland in Congress would be raised. And if there was money left over, they'd raise the Merrimack too. So proposals were put out in the newspapers. This is a slightly later one, but in June of 1862, proposals were requested, and several came in, and even though it was announced it was $100,000, everyone had different ideas of how much it would take. The winning bid was $8,000 for the Cumberland, and so that one, he was planning on raising every vessel that was sunk in Hampton Roads. Others offered to recover any bodies from the Cumberland for free. Some of them believed that it would take $855,000 to raise Cumberland. That was a no-go. And some of them just had no idea what they would be getting into. So when one of the salvers came down, it was Captain Wells of Boston. He was the winning bid, with 300 men and 4 whale ships. They were supposed to go survey Cumberland. They did. They found it in good shape, but in very difficult conditions, especially for 19th century diving. She was being scoured out by she was in the channel. It was very difficult visually for the divers to see anything. And so they kind of piddled around at Gosport Navy Yard with some of the ships still sunk there, and then disappeared. So never received their money, never raised anything of consequence. Later on in 1864, this particular ad was placed in newspapers around the country, and in it says, "It will be required that the contractors commence as soon as practicable on the Cumberland, and not to engage or commence on any other wreck without permission from the government until she is disposed of. The government will also claim the right of designating the order in which, after Cumberland, the wrecks are to be raised. The government had learned its lesson with the last contract. Now, this contract eventually goes to DA, or David Underdown, who would spend more of his money than he would ever get back from the government on trying to raise the wrecks. But he knew immediately after looking at Cumberland that she was not going to be possible to raise. He did build a cofferdam around Congress and raised most of that vessel, and raised huge chunks of the Virginia before succumbing to a stroke, probably because he was a diver in the 19th century and they didn't have all the science that we have today. So ultimately, you've heard from John how artifacts came up in the 80s and were also illegally taken from the wreck. I will not cover those here. But I did find one interesting little tidbit. It's this article here about a woman this is in the Norfolk Landmark, and in the 1880s, she decided to light her home with a candle that had washed ashore from Cumberland, and it made the newspaper. So even years later, Cumberland was still in people's memories. And I'll leave you with these few images here. This is one of the most eloquent artifacts I think I have ever seen. It's currently on display at Mariners Museum, but it is owned by the Navy. This is a gun that was at Gosport when the Union Navy was destroying it to keep things out of the hands of the Confederates. The trunnions are actually very badly damaged, but the gun was still serviceable. It was not originally on board the frigate Merrimack, but it was placed on board the ironclad Virginia. And it is one of the two guns that Cumberland's brave gunner crews destroyed that day on March 8th. You can see the jagged edges here, and as the Virginia crew continued to fire this gun, it was setting the edges of the casemate on fire. Now, the reason why this gun is in such good shape is it was not on board the Virginia when she was scuttled on May 11th of 1862. Because it was damaged, it was useless, so it was taken off of the ship at Gosport Navy Yard and left there. And so when the Union retook the Navy Yard, they took this as their trophy. And when the conservators at Mariners Museum cleaned all the years of Navy paint off of it, they found, I don't know how well you can read this, but they found this engraving on it that commemorates the March 8th battle, but also addresses the failed attempts to destroy the gun in April of 1861. Artifacts from the Cumberland, of course, you can see here at Hampton Roads Naval Museum, and if you haven't seen them here, please, please go see them because they are absolutely spectacular. And as I always like to do, I like to be up to the minute, so just for fun, I looked up what might be out there for auction from the Cumberland right now. Believe it or not, I found stuff that you can buy online. The first piece here is not made out of the Cumberland. It is just a little icon that was carved on board the Union ship Cimarron in honor of the Cumberland's crew. It's made just from random wood and iron that a sailor created, maybe for a sweetheart at home. And then here is one of the pieces that someone collected from the Cumberland as she lay in Hampton Roads with her sails still on the yards. Someone cut a little piece off here. So you can still find these things. They are still out there, and they are still waiting to tell their stories. Now, ships that are wrecked by the elements, as well as ships brought down by an enemy, do retain a certain magic. They become frozen in time, a snapshot of death and destruction, a tomb for those trapped within, and a museum of objects that were curated by the crew and exhibited by the forces that brought the ship down. The ship's career before, though important, becomes secondary to her final moments in public perception. And the landscape that ship creates, both physical and cognitive, resonates outward from the moment she settles on the bottom. So thus, pieces of the Cumberland were dispersed throughout the country, through salvage, through imagery and poetry, song and prose, and the very bodies of the men who lost their lives on the March 8th of 1862. And that physical and cognitive landscape stretches for countless miles, radiating ever outward from the vessel's resting place and remaining forever in our collective memory. Thank you.